Good afternoon again to those who have just joined us for our webinar on understanding of the intersections between violence against women and children. My name is Wessel van den Berg from Sonke Gender Justice and the Menke Global Fatherhood Campaign, and I will be your moderator this afternoon. The Children's Institute at the University of Cape Town, together with the South African Medical Research Council, Gender and Health Research Unit, and Sonke Gender Justice are hosting a series of webinars promoting an understanding of the intersections between violence against women and children. A special thank you to everyone for this valuable partnership. With that being said, I would like to first invite Professor Shanaz Matthews to briefly share with us the aim of these seminars that will take place on every Tuesday for the next 5 weeks. Just to mention that Shanaz is the director of the Children's Institute and a professor in the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Cape Town. She has a PhD in public health from the University of the Witwatersrand, and she has 30 years experience in the women's and children's sectors and has worked within civil society organizations as an academic and technical advisor to government programs, specializing in violence against women and children. Her research has spanned both violence against women and violence against children over the past 2 decades. Her research on the intersections of violence against women and children has focused on the understanding of how childhood adversities shape men's violence towards intimate partners, and on service responses to the co-victimization of mothers and children. Thank you so much for joining us and for opening this series and the first webinar today, Shanaz. Let me hand over to you to open for us. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Am I on screen or?
Yes.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon session. I would have loved for it to be an in-person seminar, but unfortunately circumstances has not made that possible. So just thinking about why we're hosting this seminar series, as Wessel alluded in introducing me, that my work on both violence against women and violence against children over the past nearly 2 decades have certainly highlighted some of these intersections. But I think it's really important that we highlight that the intersections of violence against women and violence against children was really highlighted over the past decade or so, and the No Violence report highlights both problems as being widespread as well as interconnected. If we think about violence against children, we know that in fact, the slide's a bit wrong. So about 50% of all children have experienced violence, or just over 1 billion children worldwide have experienced some form of violence, while 1 in 3 women have experienced IPV. But I think for the first time, we're also seeing that the Sustainable Development Goals have highlighted the need to include indicators as well as targets to reduce both violence against women and violence against children. And it's these intersections that's really, really critical if we're wanting to start shifting the landscape and shifting the problem of violence against women and violence against children. But it's really important that we start acknowledging that violence occurs across the lifespan, and it doesn't just occur during childhood, and that it's a trajectory and it has a cumulative effect. And I think, it's the research that I've done, as well as working within clinical practice, that have highlighted to me the importance of needing to think about these problems as being interconnected. And I'm hoping that through the seminar series that we can engage in dialogue and discussion. And I think the important part and why we're doing this is that over the past 2 to 3 years within South Africa, one of the big areas that we've been discussing is how do we start thinking about how our programming should be targeting both forms of violence, violence against women and children, to increase our impact. And I think we haven't yet gotten to getting solutions. And I think part of what the aim of this workshop and the seminar series is really about, firstly, seminar 1 today is delving deep into understanding what are the interconnections. Next week, seminar 2, we're hoping to hear from global partners like Alessandra Guedes, who's done a lot of work in over the past decade on the interconnections, and as well as Elizabeth Dartnell from the SVRI, who would both be talking about global frameworks. And our third seminar series, we're going to bring it back to Africa to start thinking about what are the evidence base around interventions that's making a difference. I'm going to stop there because I want to hand over back to Wessel, but really to extend a warm welcome to everyone once again. And I'm really excited about the next 5 weeks and hoping that we can really get your participation and using the chat and engaging with us during the course of this afternoon. Over to you, Wessel.
Thank you. Before I introduce the panelists for today's webinar, it's really useful in these webinars to go through some housekeeping rules. So let me share a few with you. The first one is that the panelists will present for 20 minutes. For some the presentations. Action. I hear you, but as you hand, please do type your questions or during the. Unfortunately, it's likely that we will comments. Will download. On hashtag against Makola. And patterning of T behind. The current research focus is on the against women. Thank you so much, and over to you, Lehlogonolo.
Thank you so much, Vessels. I'd like to also apologize to our guests or participants that have joined for the technical glitch that Vessel is experiencing on his side. We are working on it, and hopefully it will be fixed soon. But thank you for introducing me, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be presenting plenary findings from a scoping review on the understanding of the intersections between violence against women and violence against children. And this is work that contributes to a project that is placed at the Children's Institute, which focuses mainly on the intersections of violence against women and violence against children. And the scoping review that I'm presenting is ongoing, but these are the people that are contributing towards its development. As Shanas has already touched on a little bit, violence against women and violence against children are conceptualized as global public health and women rights problems. And we know that these forms of violence has historically been developed to exist as separate fields. And while that is the case, we see that there's continuous evidence that shows that, in fact, these forms of violence are connected. And we see this with the fact that they co-occur in the same household, they share the same risk factors, and also tend to be more prevalent in societies where social norms that promote violence tend to be condoned. What we see is that women and children that experience violence, they tend to share similar health outcomes, which also have an impact on the intergenerational transmission of violence. Throughout the years, we see that there's an increased interest and recognition of the connections between violence against women and violence against children, and we see that has led to a raised need for a coordinated response in addressing these forms of violence, but also a need for us to have a deepened understanding of how violence against women and violence against children intersect, particularly looking into low to middle income countries or global south countries. What we already have is evidence that shows that indeed violence against women and violence against children intersect at multiple levels. But what we see is that this information is mainly drawn from the global north. And I must also acknowledge the work that has already laid the foundation for us in the low and middle income countries with the Bridging the Gap work, for instance, that was published in 2016 by Alexandra Goddess and her team. And that also has helped us with highlighting and understanding these intersections. But what we want to do in this scoping review is just to provide an understanding of how violence against women and violence against children intersect, particularly in the home environment. And we specifically want to focus in the global south, and also recognize or potential interventions that show a promise of working and also further maybe even being replicated somewhere else as well. And we also want to have an understanding of the common drivers of violence against women and violence against children within the household, but also want to have an understanding of the impact of violence at home, particularly on the immediate and long-term consequences. I must just indicate that because this is a scoping review, I'm going to be focusing on the literature aspect, and in the third seminar, where we will have an African focus, as Shanas has mentioned, we are going to also highlight on some of these promising interventions that are mainly focused in the African continent. So in conducting our scoping review, we engaged through a three-stage literature review process, where in the beginning we did a review of reports that were placed or were coming from organizations such as UNICEF and WHO. We also did a search of databases that are listed on this slide, and also did a manual identification of papers that we could not be able to retrieve through stage 1 and stage 2. Before I go into the inclusion and exclusion criteria for this review, I just want to indicate that our search strategy was mainly underpinned by the work that Alexandra Goddess and her team have done and published in 2016, particularly highlighting the intersections of violence against women and violence against children in these 6 key areas. So we considered papers that were published between January 2000 to February 2020 that were in English, and we also considered any study design in our review. We also included papers that were grey literature that focused mainly in low and middle income countries. What we did was also exclude countries that were mainly from the European region due to the contextual differences from the other countries that were included. And in our review, we wanted to mainly focus on papers that addressed violence against women and violence against children, or addressed one form of violence with a specific focus on the identification of the intersections as per the slide that I showed previously. So this is still an ongoing work, so there's a chance that some papers would also be included as we continue with the scoping review. But so far we were able to retrieve about 5,406 papers, which wherein we also removed duplicates, and we eventually were able to screen about 129 papers, and at the moment we have included 84 papers. So while I have mentioned in the beginning that our focus and what we want to address in this scoping review, and which we think adds to the gap that already exists in the literature that we have, is the home environment, how violence against women and violence against children intersect within a household. And while that is the case, we also acknowledge that it is very impossible or difficult to treat a household as an isolated entity which does not intersect with other factors within the environment. And similarly, we see with the socio-ecological framework that was proposed by the CDC and WHO, which help us understand violence prevention, that we understand that all these factors influence each other, that there are a web of factors, risk factors that can be within the society that would influence what happens within the household, and similarly what happens in the household could also influence what happens in other levels within the society. So it's very, very difficult to just say this is an isolated entity. And you also see with the results that we found that there seem to be an influence amongst the factors that we found to be contributing towards these experiences. So our review was grounded in the feminist theory, and the feminist theory is normally associated with equality. And in relation to violence against women and violence against children, the feminist theory recognizes that due to the unequal powers that are placed over other people due to their gender, race, class, or sexual orientation, we find that some people, particularly women and children, become vulnerable to violence. And that is because within a household, a woman would have less power compared to men, but both women and children would have, women and men would have more power compared to the children. The feminist theory, similar to the framework that I presented before, also shows that while violence could occur within the household, we should also consider the broader context that could also influence what happens within the household. So what happens outside the household has an impact on what happens within the household. So and what we see through the intersectional feminist framework is that patriarchal hierarchy and male power that continues to place women and children at a subordinate position enables them to then be vulnerable to experiences of violence. So in our findings, we were able to find 4 risk factors that were associated with the intersections between violence against women and violence against children. And that is common risk factors, shared social norms, the co-occurrence of violence within the same household, and compounding intergenerational effects. I must just indicate that previous evidence had shown that adolescence was a strong risk factor to the intersections of violence against against women and violence against children. But in our scoping review, we find that within the household, the adolescence was not a very clear cut in terms of it being a strong predisposing factor. So with regard to shared social norm, we see that, or we found that social norms that promote violent discipline and violent masculinities were found to reinforce victimization or perpetration of violence against women and children, and that societies that tend to tolerate or find normalize violence tend to also like violence behavior tend to also lead to children and women being more vulnerable to such experiences. And we saw in studies that were conducted both in Africa and in Asia that mothers who themselves experienced violence were likely to also believe that children should be disciplined through physical punishment. And it's not just only about the mother having a belief, but the modeling of behavior that then makes children also believe in the acceptability and the normalization of such violent activities of violent behaviors within the household. And we see this with studies that were also conducted in Asia, where boys' experiences of violence or abuse during childhood shaped their own belief system and also increased their likelihood of perpetrating intimate partner violence later on. So another factor that has been associated with the vulnerability to violence amongst women and children has been the culture of silence. In our review, we find that women who were likely to prioritize family experience, family privacy, and also keeping the family together over their own well-being. And we see that these practices not only affected their own experiences of violence, but also affected on how children perceived the susceptibility again of violence, because we saw in studies, for instance, in the study that was conducted in Africa, particularly in Kenya, where boy and girl children found it acceptable that women should stay in marriages for the sake of keeping the family together, but also for the sake of children. So already from a young age, children are already being socialized into the understanding that these are norms that are acceptable and should be tolerated. Another important factor that is also associated with the culture of silence is the barrier to reporting abuse or seeking help. We know that and across various countries, including South Africa, there's one thing to experience violence and there's another to then also report those experiences of violence. And while it's very, very complicated to also talk about these processes, but we see that that also was a predisposer to experiences of violence against women as well as children. So our review also showed 4 common risk factors that were associated with experiences of violence against women as well as violence against children, and in particular the unequal gender power dynamics that existed between children and men as well as women. And we find that in households where women had and children had less power than their men, they were more vulnerable to violence. And we found a strong association across various countries within Africa and Asia of multiple factors which also made women more vulnerable to experiences of violence, and these were linked to not being educated or having low education, being unemployed, and having minimal decision-making power within the household or within the relationship. And that also impacted on the dominance of a man, the controlling behavior of a man within the household, which did not only impact on the experiences of violence for the child, but for the woman, but also for the child in terms of the parenting styles that were even harsher within the household. What we also found was that a conflict between partners was associated with intimate partner violence, but also associated with various forms of violence experiences amongst children. And we also found a strong relationship between the harmful use of alcohol as well as risk of experiencing intimate partner violence. So as I had mentioned earlier on, and I think that that appears here as well is that violence against women and violence against children tend to co-occur in the same household due to the risk factors that are similar, but also due to social norms that promote violence that are then also condoned. And what we see is that children that came from households that were violent were also at a greater risk of experiencing violence as well as perpetrating. And like what Shana's explained in her introduction, that it's a life course process where one's experiences of violence in childhood tend to also happen throughout, but also means that it also increases their likelihood of also being perpetrators of violence later when they are also adult. And we see this specifically with a study that was conducted here in South Africa amongst men who were in prison for killing their intimate partners, where childhood traumas as well as being exposed to intimate partner violence earlier on and developing violent masculinities was amongst factors that also contributed to them also being perpetrators of violence later on in life. So what we also see is that violence transmits from one generation to another, and therefore, that's where the interconnection of it occurs, where we understand, as I've mentioned even before, that exposure to intimate partner violence at the home environment has negative consequences on children's well-being, for instance, and how they develop. And that when children are exposed to violence, they are likely to also not only have it as an event, but also have it influencing how they are also the kind of adults that they become. We see with men that childhood trauma was associated with increased risk of perpetrating intimate partner violence in adulthood, as well as with women also being victims of physical or sexual intimate partner violence in adulthood as well. So what I think the scoping review does is, especially today, is just to provide you with an understanding of what happens in the household, particularly in terms of the various forms of violence that occurs with the household, but how they also have a ripple effect on the livelihood and the lifespan of an individual, and that exposure to violence in childhood has an increased risk of both victimization or perpetration of violence even later on in adulthood. So with this understanding of the drivers of violence against women and violence against children, we also need to start thinking about how do we coordinate our own prevention efforts to make sure that we then respond or even prevent the occurrence of violence. And in terms of social norms, particularly gender norms and social norms, as gender inequalities and social norms, as they tend to come across very strongly as the main factors that also contribute to women and children being vulnerable to violence. How do we work around changing these norms to ensure that we also lessen these experiences of violence against women and violence against children? And also understanding that the child and women sectors exist in separately in most countries, and also now understanding that what happens to the child and the woman in the same household has many impact that intersect. How do we then have a collaborated response to then address these forms of violence, and in total, how do we then break the cycle of the intergenerational transmission that occurs between violence that occurs amongst adults and also violence that children are also exposed to, and the likelihood of how they are then likely to then perpetrate or become victims of violence later on in life. So with that, I'd like to thank you and go back to Vessel.
Thank you so much, Ms. Lehlogonolo. I really appreciate your presentation. I noted a few items in your presentation, and the overarching theme for me that emerges is the pervasiveness of violence. And, you know, firstly, the fact that it's really difficult to treat a household as isolated from the community around it. But then secondly, that the violence transfers intergenerationally between parents and children, but also there are common risks across various countries that emerged from this scoping review. So thank you so much for that presentation. I also think this point that you made right at the end for the need of collaboration between the women's rights sector and the children's sector is an important pathway going ahead. So I really appreciate your presentation. Thank you so much. We will keep documenting the questions and answers, or sorry, the questions at least, no answers yet, as we go along through the presentation. And after our next panelist has presented, we will then go into questions and answers for both presenters. But for now, let me introduce a short clip from a video that Sonke has produced a few years ago, where a man speaks about his experiences of violence in his life. At the time, this man, Jerry, was participating in an ex-offender reintegration program that Sonke was implementing called Beyond the Bars. This clip is only an extract, and the full video is available on our website. So can we please watch the film, and then I will introduce our next panelist. Thank you.
My name is Jerry Monwabi Simbetani. I'm from Langa. The role of violence when I grew up in my community was so, I think has contributed to my crime, which I committed, which is a sexual offense. Yeah. Because we grew up in a society where, for example, in your household, you experience maybe during the weekend when maybe your parents have paid, and maybe there's some alcohol involved, and then there will be like some interaction in terms of where's the money, and then maybe the father doesn't want to give the money to the mother, and then there will be those kind of squabbles, and then you kind of experience the violence whilst growing up, and thinking that it is something which is normal, and also especially when on weekends when people are drunk at the family, even outside around our community. We grew up in an environment where there are a lot of siblings. People are always drinking on weekends, and we will get access to go in those places because maybe we'll be sent to buy a beer, and you will experience violence, or maybe you'll go there with your parents and experience some violence when people are drunk and fighting, and even gangs around the community. There were gangs. We grew up where there were gangs around our community, whereby people by then we were fighting with pangas and knives and all those kind of things. So our life was mostly clouded with violence. Yeah, even in sports field, when there were some arguments in a sporting match, whatever, it will end up in a violence, in rugby or whatever. Like people getting knives and stabbing each other. So we grew up in that kind of land, but indirectly, all those things that you are suffering, you are experiencing, even the times of apartheid, where there was violence, where the cops will come and hit people around, where people will be hitting other people for going to work if they want to stay away. So violence, you grow up with thinking that it's something normal, and it's something that you learn indirectly, not directly. You learn indirectly by experience, and then maybe in life, and I've experienced it when I came to prison. I thought I was a person who is calm, who can control himself, but there was a time in prison where I will be angry, and I will hit people and things that I didn't know that I could do. And first I thought it was prison that was doing that to me, but I realized that no, it is not prison. It was something that was already instilled in me, but it was just it was just waiting for a spark to happen. And then when I started dealing with that, I realized that no, the history comes from my background.
You can just unmute. Faisal, can you unmute?
Thank you, Garth. Sorry, I was talking to myself there. I was speaking about wonderful things, the hashtags and the social media and everything. So I'm still adapting to this new online world. As Shanaz was saying, in a live event, it's harder to mute each other. So let me pass to our second panelist. Our second panelist is Dr. Merceline Machisa. Dr. Machisa is a specialist scientist at the South African Medical Research Council Gender and Health Research Unit and an honorary lecturer at the University of Witwatersrand School of Public Health. She has led research studies about violence against women in 5 South African countries, including Zimbabwe, Lesotho, Mauritius, Botswana, and South Africa. And more recently, her work has focused on understanding the complex structural pathways that drive intimate partner violence, perpetrated by men and experienced by women, which we will hear about today. After leading a national project that evaluated the health sector and criminal justice response to rape in South Africa, she is currently leading a research project in 8 higher education institutions, which includes formative research, development and testing the effectiveness of the Ntombi Vimbela sexual violence intervention, which targets female students. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Machisa. I now hand over to you, Merceline, to present to us. Thank you. I think you also need to unmute yourself.
Thanks, Faisal, and thank you for this opportunity to talk about my work. A good afternoon to you all. I think we have heard from Lelo about the intersections that are there, that are evident, that are known between childhood abuse and intimate partner violence. And in this presentation, I'm just going to sort of demonstrate some of these intersections through work that we have conducted and we have published that has looked at the structural pathways between childhood abuse and intimate partner violence. So already, not to belabor the point, there is an acknowledgement that violence against women and violence against children are co-occurring problems, and they are driven by the same risk factors, and they are sustained through an intergenerational cycles. We have acknowledged that violence against women and violence against children are also quite high in societies where there is high levels of violence in general and high levels of gender inequality. What has not been said much is how also there is intersections between violence against women, violence against children, and settings of poverty. And I think it has been mentioned how violence against women and violence against children have impacts on health, and in particular, impacts on mental ill health. And you will see in the data that I'm going to present here that I had a particular interest in, the impacts on mental health and how it perpetuates this cycle of violence. So I think over time we have established these intersections through mostly analysis that has focused on associations, whereby we look at an outcome and the different risk factors, but very little has been done in terms of trying to understand the interrelationship of factors, both with the intimate partner violence outcome, but also between themselves. And so our research focused on trying to understand these interrelationships between variables, which I will also talk about as pathways between childhood abuse and intimate partner violence. And in this respect, we were interested in men's perpetration of intimate partner violence and women's experiences of intimate partner violence. So the work I'm presenting right now comes from a dedicated violence against women survey that was conducted by the SAMRC and Gender Links in Gauteng, South Africa in 2011. For those who are not very familiar with South Africa, Gauteng province is the most populous of the 9 provinces that we have in the country, and it almost spans the region or the locations around Johannesburg and Pretoria and the surrounds. In our survey, we used a multi-stage random sampling approach that helped us to obtain a provincially representative sample, so that whatever findings we have here, we believe they are generalizable to the region that I've spoken about. In terms of the sample of participants who were included in this analysis, there was 511 women and 487 men, and all of them were above the age of 18. What we did in terms of the data analysis was that we used descriptive statistics to help us to determine the prevalence of the different factors that we measured and were interested in. And then we also conducted what is called regression modeling that helps us to understand the associations, the linear associations between variables and intimate partner violence outcome. And I think the additional value of this work is in the type of analysis that we conducted beyond the regression modeling, which is the structural equation modeling. And you will see when I start to present the findings how this helps us to understand more about the intersections than just the regression modeling, because then we are able to see through diagrams the relationship between factors. So just to run through the prevalence of the different factors that we measured childhood abuse, and this was a retrospective measurement, because remember our participants are adults, and so they had to think back to when they were children and what their experiences were. And we found a very high prevalence of childhood abuse amongst men and women. 86% amongst the women, and high prevalence amongst men, and this being more actually physical abuse experiences, with 80% of men having experienced this. We were interested in the exposures to trauma and also to mental ill health amongst the men and the women, and we found that the men reported a higher prevalence of post-traumatic stress symptoms, and in terms of depression, there was almost similar prevalence amongst men and women, and we found that the men were reporting higher prevalence of binge drinking, which is an indicator of severe alcohol abuse. So in terms of the intimate partner violence, it was also clear that intimate partner violence was a reality to most of the participants in our sample. 50% of women had experienced this, and 56% of men had actually physically assaulted their partners in their lifetime. And I think what is quite stuck in this data is how most of the men who had perpetrated intimate partner violence had actually done so more than once, so they had done it repeatedly. So when we did the regression modeling, which I said would help us to just understand the linear associations between factors and men's IPV perpetration, we found that childhood abuse, having experienced childhood abuse, working in the past 12 months, reporting PTSD symptoms, and having experienced other life trauma, which in this case included things like having witnessed the murder of someone who was close or someone who was a stranger, or having been hijacked, or being a victim of crime, or having had a near-death experience, those increase the risk for men's perpetration of violence. And we found that what was protective of men's perpetration of violence was having highly equitable gender beliefs. So I know this may be intimidating for some people, but these are the kinds of outputs that you get when you conduct structural equation modeling. And as you can see, we are able to see the relationships between the different factors, and these are connected by what we call paths, which are the arrows that are between factors. And I think what we are seeing here is that the data that we got from these men in Gauteng really is conforming to the theories that Lelo was speaking about in terms of how violence is transmitted from childhood to adulthood. So you would see that here we have a direct pathway from childhood trauma and intimate partner violence, and she has explained the intergenerational transmission of family violence theory, whereby children grow up and they normalize violence, and they see it as acceptable and therefore become aggressive and violent themselves. So that path is quite clear. And she's talked about the feminist theories, which are represented by the path here that is mediated by the gender inequitable beliefs, whereby through socialization and experiences, men get to develop these beliefs about how men and women should relate, and that in itself feeds into the perpetration of intimate partner violence. I think the extra or the new emerging stuff that is coming out from this diagram is really this portion of the diagram whereby we see that the mental ill effects of childhood trauma, including the depression, the PTSD, are then being associated with men's intimate partner violence perpetration. And also we see the same, that them having experienced trauma increases exposure to other traumas, and in turn that also increases their chances of perpetrating intimate partner violence. And of course there is a central contribution of these PTSD symptoms. I'm going to switch now to talk about the women. I think I've talked about how we have 511 women in this data sets that we looked at, and we found that having experienced other life trauma and having poor mental health, including binge drinking, depression, PTSD symptoms, increased women's risk of IPV. And I think this has been shown through other reviews that have been conducted, for example, the one by De Vries that has shown these associations. And what was protective was being an older woman, being a South African compared to being a foreigner, and having higher sexual relationship power was protective of women's experiences of intimate partner violence in the past year. So we are back to those models again, the structural equation modeling. And in essence, what you do when you do modeling is you come up with a hypothesis, and then you test it on your data, and then you assess what is here in the bottom of my slide, which are the fit statistics. And if you get figures such as these, then you say that your hypothesis fits, your data fits the hypothesis, and so it is a viable model. And so in this first model that we looked at using the women's data, we made the assumption that women's mental ill health that is associated with childhood abuse increases their risk of intimate partner violence. And this is confirmed. You can see that there is no direct pathway between childhood abuse and intimate partner violence. Rather, we are seeing these mediated paths going through depression, binge drinking, PTSD to intimate partner violence. And then, of course, we have the other pathway that is consistent with the feminist theories that says childhood abuse affects how women view themselves and conduct themselves in relationships, and having lower sexual relationship power, and that in itself affects their experiences of intimate partner violence. We'll look at the second model, and in this model, because there is evidence of reciprocal pathways between mental ill health and women's experiences of violence, in this model, we were testing whether some of the PTSD, depression, and binge drinking that we were seeing in the women was actually a result of their experiences of intimate partner violence. And what you can see is that these fit statistics here show that this is a viable model. And so, in essence, what we are saying using this data from South Africa is that there is indication that, you know, mental ill health is a very important thing in terms of thinking about women's intimate partner violence experiences, because it is both a risk factor and an effect of their experiences. So I think what our work has done is that it is through the use of the methods that I've talked about, particularly the structural equation modeling, we are able to sort of talk more definitely about these intersections than if we had used the traditional regression methods. And of course, when we looked at the models, it was clear that violence against women and violence against children could be explained firstly by the feminist theory that talks about the contribution of, you know, gender-related factors, but also the intergenerational transmission and social learning theories, where we were getting direct associations between just experiencing violence and either becoming very violent or selecting partners who were violent in the case of women. And I think what is emergent in our work is how we need to start thinking about mental health and how it contributes to the cycle of violence. So just to say a bit about what then it means for prevention, because of the interest that is there and that Lelo has talked about in terms of how do we collaborate, how do we work together, what needs to be done to break this cycle of violence that we've been talking about. I think it becomes much clearer that we need to be thinking about holistic and multiple strategies to deal with violence against women and violence against children, and these need to encompass things such as positive parenting interventions and, you know, regulation to reduce corporal punishment in schools, given that we found a very high prevalence of physical abuse of children. And here we have shown that it is impacting on how they relate to their partners later in life. And the fact that we have seen the long-term mental health effects of childhood abuse means that although children are experiencing very high levels of violence, there really is little intervention in terms of their mental health. And so these mental health effects then have prolonged effects because they are undetected or untreated. And so we need to be thinking about how do we have responses that help children and women survivors to deal with these traumatic experiences, and of course their children. I think Lelo has talked about how children whose mothers are abused are affected. And of course, you know, we need interventions for women who are abused and interventions for men who are perpetrators of violence. And it has been long acknowledged that these interventions must have gender transformative elements. But I think what our studies are showing that is, you know, is that it is important that interventions also have psychotherapeutic or psychosocial elements to deal with the mental ill health issues. So I guess just to conclude, what we are finding from this data and from what Lelo shared earlier is that really it's kind of a conundrum whereby, you know, we can't really afford to address one without the other or to work in silos, because really the problems that we are dealing with are interrelated. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marceline, for that very thought-provoking presentation. As I was listening to you, I could pick up the real trajectory of the experience of violence in childhood and the effects in adulthood. And a few striking things that I drew from the presentation is the fact that there was such a high prevalence of child abuse reported by all the men and women in the sample. And how that then linked to current experiences of post-traumatic stress disorder and depression, and also how that then turned out to be central in terms of men's drivers of the use of violence. But what was interesting also then is that, as you pointed out, that mental health was both a risk factor and an effect for intimate partner violence in terms of women's lives and experience. In terms of the recommendations that you made for practice, I briefly want to just reference a evidence brief that the Children's Institute, Sonke, Promundo, and a few other organizations worked on, which we launched at the previous SVRI actually, which documents the evidence-based interventions that can respond to exactly this problem of how one interrupts these pathways of transference of violence in terms of using psychosocial support. So thank you so much for that presentation. We will now move to the Q&A section of the webinar. And thank you so much to everyone for sending along questions through the Q&A. As I said at the beginning, we will not be able to respond to all of the questions that were raised, but we will download the chat report and we will ask the panelists to respond individually after the webinar. So I will now, we have about half an hour left. We are doing well on time, everyone. So thank you so much for being within your time frames for presenting. I will first read out a few questions for Lehlogonolo. We have 3 questions, and then I will give Lehlogonolo an opportunity to answer, and then I will pass to Dr. Machisa. So Lehlogonolo, the first question is, can you give us an example of how an action to address violence against children can also help prevent violence against women? Also, I really would like to flag that the 3rd webinar will address interventions. So please join us for that conversation, because that question actually summarizes that webinar really well. But for today, if you can just answer that question of how an action to address violence against children can also help prevent violence against women. The second question is also linked to that. In terms of co-occurrence, could you explain in the scoping review how this was defined? It sounded like the same perpetrator could be using violence against adult women and children in the household. Is this how the concept was applied? So the second one is about co-occurrence and if it's referring to the same perpetrator. And then the third question is, in terms of the use of the word alcohol, was alcohol the only factor, or did it go broader to substance abuse as opposed to drugs, etc.? So, Lehlogonolo, I will pass to you. Kindly unmute yourself and then you can respond to those 3 questions. Thank you.
Yeah, so in terms of the third question, we mainly conducted a review, and alcohol was the main factor that came out. So we cannot tell about other factors because this is just based on what is available, the published literature that we could find, specifically focusing on the Global South. So maybe that is a gap that we continue to look into and see if there would be more literature on it. But at the moment, the association was mainly based on alcohol because that's what we found. With regard to, I'm getting a sense that the time, with regard to the second question, so we looked into studies that would report both forms of violence occurring within the same household. And in some studies, you'd find that the same person would perpetrate against children and women as well, but it was not all the studies. And with regard to the first question, I think we would leave it to the third seminar because that's the gist of that seminar. So we would leave it to that.
Thank you so much, Lehlogonolo, for the response. So the first question to Ms. Aline is, I would be interested to know if any of the research studies focused on or included women and children with disabilities, and surely they are even more vulnerable or at risk. Then the second question is, which social norms can be highlighted as the most prominent drivers of violence against women and violence against children? And the third question is, did the study show any relationship between poverty and the effects of violence? Then a final question, there's a fourth one, is to the good doctor. Did your study reveal the link between violence against children experienced in childhood and perpetration of violence as an adult? So those four questions to you, Dr. Machisa. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Faisal. So I will take the last question first. And yes, that's what our research did, because we interviewed adults, and the childhood abuse that we are talking about it had happened prior. And so that's what we were sort of trying to understand. And of course, all the other factors were then measured in the present. So we could see from our analysis the impacts of the childhood abuse on what was happening in adulthood. The question around women with disabilities and their children, this was a population-based survey, and we really at that point did not ask the women about their disability status, and so we are not able to talk much about their disability and how it was sort of affecting their experiences of violence. But given that it is really a representative sample, we believe that the women who were disabled would have been included, but really this would be women who were sort of physically disabled. In terms of the inclusion criteria for and an exclusion criteria for the study, we excluded participants who were mentally challenged because we did not see them as being able to answer and to complete the questionnaire. So there was just an exclusion criteria that we used for the survey. And in terms of the poverty, intersections with poverty, I think in this data set, when we conducted the regression modeling, we found no associations between poverty and or poverty-related factors and experience or perpetration of violence, and which for us was really to say that the intimate partner violence was really occurring across the divides, whether across social class. And that's why you find even when we do the structural modeling, we have not really included it there, because in this data set, there was no such associations. And in terms of this, the social norms which we are driving intimate partner violence, I think we've used a scale that is common to understand gender beliefs, including the relationship, the gender equitable men's scale, and some of these norms are norms around male sexual entitlement, whereby a man says that if for example, in our South African settings, if I've paid lobola, which is bride price, then I'm entitled to have sex with my wife whenever I want it, or notions that say that you are justified to beat your wife, for example, when she's done wrong or has, or is doing things that threaten your position. So, yeah, so those are so it's really norms around male dominance, around male sexual entitlement, and yeah, so those were the notions that were driving perpetration and experiences of violence. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Machisa. Then a few other questions that have come up through the Q&A tab. I'll read in a moment, but I wanted to check with you, Lehlogonolo, if you wanted to comment on any of the questions or responses that Marceline had, because there was also some questions on the coverage of research studies. Did you want to come in there for a moment?
No.
Okay, are you okay? Okay, that's fine. So then, in terms of reading some of the questions that were posted, there's one, and I think let me pass this to you, Lehlogonolo. So, any tools developed so far on addressing the cultural dimensions of violence against women and violence against children? Are there any examples of successful interventions, even if small pilot studies?
Again, I think we are going to specifically talk more about the interventions in the third seminar, particularly that focuses again on interventions that focus on children, also focus on adults as well, and some of the cultural or social norms that have been changed through these norms.
Thank you. And then a question to Marceline. Will there be or is there research on the various mental health issues affecting children in terms of violence against children?
So I think they are there, but the Children's Institute people would be able to talk more about the research that is focusing on violence against children and the mental health issues. Lelo, maybe you can share from your portfolio the research that you're doing with children right now that focuses on mental health.
I can call on Lucy and Shanaz to also talk more about that, the work that has been done on that.
Lucy, do you want to come in there?
So, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm actually going to speak or reflect on a study that Shanaz led. I thought she would have jumped in, but I can't see her camera on.
I can answer.
Okay.
Do you want me to respond?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So perhaps you're not seeing me, but you can hear me. So we've conducted research to look at mental health outcomes for children post experiences of violence. And what we did find is, and we measured for particularly PTSD, we measured for depression and anxiety. And what we found was soon after disclosure, you had really high levels of anxiety and depression. And we repeated the measures a year after, so at different intervals, but a year after disclosure, we still found that about if a third of children still measured full scale, so they met all the criteria for full scale, for full symptom PTSD. So nearly 30% of children. If you looked at partial symptom PTSD, 50% of children still met the criteria for partial symptoms. So 1 out of the 3 areas that you measure for PTSD symptomatology, they'd still measure positive for that, which shows that even after having been through services, the children a year after disclosure and having been to services, nearly over 80%, so nearly 80% of children, about 75% of children are still symptomatic, which tells us a lot about our mental health services and also our counselling services in South Africa. And what I'm very clear about is that our services are not meeting the needs of children. And there are two reasons for that. The first is that we are not, so if you start looking at the psychosocial services provided, it's not based on what is not evidence-based, and very few services are using the kind of mental health interventions that are promoted globally. And I think that's one of the main things that we should be thinking about. How, so if we're saying in South Africa, about a third of children have been exposed to either physical or sexual abuse, we've got to start thinking about how do we deliver interventions at scale, which we're not doing. If we're wanting to prevent the next generation and the intergenerational cycles of violence, we've got to start intervening early. And that means every child that has been to a service needs to get an intervention that's appropriate. And we're not doing that. The second area of concern to me is that our reach is very minimal. If we're having children that are certainly abused throughout South Africa, our main services are located in our urban areas. We've got vast areas where there's no services for women or children. My work on looking at services response to co-victimization of violence against women and children have shown that our services, when they see a child, they only work with that child. When they see a woman, they only work with a woman. And they're not looking at how services need to be delivered to the whole family, actually. And therefore, what we are looking at is incredibly low levels of being able to integrate services to allow for recovery. And therefore, this drives what we are seeing is incredibly high then residual aftermath of what children have experienced. And I think the important thing is that often when women go to services, they're not asked about their own experiences. So if you're only looking at the person in front of you like a child, and the mother can't deal with the child's trauma because she herself has been traumatized as, whether as an adult or a child, you're never going to be able to create a healing environment. So I think we need to think about redesigning services completely. I'm being radical now, but I do think it's very important that we have that conversation.
Thank you so much, Shanaz. I think some of the questions have been published in the Q&A panel on the side of the seminar, and there is quite a few comments and questions about the need to integrate interventions, and that's quite encouraging. I've got two more questions. The first one is one to me and then one to Merceline. I was surprised that one of our facilitators passed a question to me, but let me read it and then have a go at responding. The question is, can we have men in Africa united to stop gender-based violence? How soon can we establish Men in Law South Africa, which can be a driver or similar to Men United in the Continent to Stop Gender-Based Violence? And then it goes on to say that it can work together with Women in Law South Africa. We both can have a common understanding and sharing details on how gender-based violence can be stopped. I really, just to respond to that, I'm really encouraged by the person who posted this question. I think it was Mpo, saying that there's a collaboration between men and women working together to end gender-based violence. I think the risk that I'm seeing in South Africa at the moment from our perspective is very much that there are men's organizations who work to counter gender-based violence without women's voices being central in that discussion. So it's really encouraging to see that there's a suggestion for a voice from the women's rights sector working with men as an included element in that response. So I thank you very much for the question, and thank you to the facilitator who passed the question to me as well. The last question, we might have time for one or two more, but the next question that came up was for Dr. Machisa, and it was just a clarification, or rather a definitive question on what is sexual relationship power. I know that that is a topic for a whole seminar on its own, but maybe if you can attempt to parse it into a quick response for us.
So sexual relationship power is really it's a construct that we measure that has to do with gender power dynamics within a relationship, and so we ask questions such as that have to do with, for example, how sex happens, how is it negotiated, so for example, women are asked, you know, are you able to talk to your partner about, you know, about sex, about how sex is happening, about condoms, about maybe their sexual history, about you know, so and things around sexual decision making. So it really is a scale that asks different questions, and then it is summed up, and you know, based on the score, we are able to then say, you know, if, for example, women feel empowered to be engaging their partners about, you know, sexual issues, then we say that they have, you know, they have higher sexual relationship power, meaning that they have, you know, they have a say, and it's not really just a say in terms of sex, but also even a say around other issues within that relationship. It could be, you know, if it's a married couple, it's really even about how the household is run, or them making a contribution in the home. So yeah, I hope that answers it, but it's really about, you know, whether you have power to be an equal partner in partnership or in a relationship.
Thank you so much, Marceline. Friends, we had a question in the Q&A which was asking about the availability of the scoping review. And just to note that the scoping review will only be published once it's finalized in the next few months. So we were actually getting a teaser or a trailer of the scoping review that is still to be released. It is not available yet, but we will share through the same mailing lists that this webinar was communicated on. We will share that report once it becomes available. I will now pass to a round of closing comments from all of the presenters, and let's do that in the order that we did the presentation. So just one or two sentences from each presenter after the webinar, something that you still want to say. I'll pass to Lehlogonolo, and then Lehlogonolo, you can pass to Marceline, who can pass to Shanaz. So it's nice that Shanaz closes for us after opening for us. So over to you, Lehlogonolo.
Okay, thank you so much, Vesalada. Thank you so much for the comments and discussions that we see in the chat room. I think the most important thing is that as we see that these forms of violence intersect, we also realize that indeed there is a need for us to have a coordinated response, both in the sectors that function separately, that we need to come together and see ways in which we can have a coordinated response in addressing these forms of violence. Otherwise, there would always be a continuous conversation around this. There will always be resources that are implemented, particularly understanding that this intergenerational effect that already shows that whatever we do now, if we don't combine our efforts to prevent violence even for the children, it means already we are seeing that it is likely to even happen moving forward. So how do we then come together and ensure that we address, particularly with the understanding of the risk factors that contribute to this occurrence?
Thank you, Lehlogonolo. Mercy, over to you. Marceline, thank you.
So I'm going to hop on what Shanaz just said prior around mental health, because I think in my work, I have seen the importance of mental health in driving the cycle of violence. And yet, at the moment, as a country, we cannot say we are doing, you know, the best that there is. And so I think lots of, you know, work has to go into the development of mental health interventions for different sectors of the society, for children, for women, for men, and thinking about not just interventions and just adopting or adapting interventions, but really thinking about what works for our context, and thinking about what can be brought to scale, and think about even models that use, you know, lay people in our communities, so that we can start to reduce both violence against women and violence against children. Thanks.
Thank you, Marceline. Over to you, Shanaz.
Yeah, how long do we have? So concluding thoughts, I think today was really an amazing start, and I'm hoping that people that joined us today will join us for a conversation over the next few weeks. My concluding thoughts are two things. The first is that South Africa last year embarked on developing a national strategic plan to end gender-based violence and femicide. I'm of the opinion that this is an important stepping stone, but unless we interrogate the plan and look at what's in that plan and hold government accountable, we're not going to, we won't see results. I fully agree with Marceline that mental health is a really, really important component of underlying why we're seeing this really high levels of violence that we often cannot make sense of. If you think of the heinous crimes that we see, men killing their whole families, or children being raped and murdered, in other societies, rape homicides of children are unusual events. In South Africa, it's the norm. A child is raped and killed every third day, and that is sad. And how do we change that pattern? Because we've got to understand that underlying a lot of why these crimes can be committed, it's because of what has happened to the person themselves, and why they're able to do this kind of crime without feeling any remorse. So underlying all of this are big conversations to be had within communities as well. I don't have the answer, but I think together we can come up with solutions. And that's why these conversations are critically important. I also want to say, that there's been this whole call for prevention, but I think in South Africa, we've got to see prevention and response as a continuum, that you can't have one without the other. So when you think of mental health interventions, it's both a response as well as a prevention. And I want to leave you with that thought, that it's not either or, that we've got to think about how we create spaces and opportunities for both to happen. And that's really where I want to leave off today, but really want to put the challenge out to everyone that we've got to engage in this conversation, and we've got to find a way forward. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Over to you, Vessel.
Thank you so much, Shanaz, for those powerful words to end us. So thanks for staying with us, everyone. And remember, this series is one of 5 webinars in promoting an understanding of the intersections between violence against women and children series over a period of 5 weeks. Today was part 1. Next week, Tuesday, at the same time, we have part 2 of the webinar series called Using Global Frameworks such as Inspire and Respect to Inform an Intersectional Approach. And Shanaz from the Children's Institute will be moderating the session, and will be joined by Alessandra Guedes from UNICEF and by Elizabeth Dartnell from SVRI. So please do RSVP to attend this next seminar, and look out for the invitations that will be going out for that one for you to register on. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a lovely evening. Goodbye.